You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 348, Creating Congress, 1787. Last week, we covered the most controversial issue of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. That was whether states should be represented in Congress by population or equal representation in each state. The convention, of course, ended up splitting the difference, giving population by representation to the House of Representatives and equal representation by state to the Senate. To reach that final agreement, however, the delegates had to agree to having two houses in the first place. While this issue was not nearly as heated as the controversial proportionality question, it did go through some back and forth. Now, the initial Virginia plan that was written by James Madison had recommended two houses of Congress, what we call a bicameral legislature. Madison considered this to be an important check on a potentially runaway majority. Although the Confederation had operated with a single house, Madison saw that as a problem. 11 of the 13 states had bicameral legislatures. Only Pennsylvania and Georgia had a single house. Of course, Britain, the model for so many things, had two houses, a House of Commons and a House of Lords. For most supporters of this two-house idea, the idea of an upper house kept the more intemperate voices of the people in the lower house from going too far. Short-term popular majorities, often led by a charismatic figure, might gain a temporary majority at times, but there was a need to keep them in check. Supporters of a single house essentially agreed with the purpose of the upper house, but said that that was a bug rather than a feature. Having one house of the legislature made up of elites who could thwart the will of the majority went against everything that a democratic republic meant. Rule by the people meant that the people should be able to implement the laws that they wanted without a tiny minority of rich old guys standing in their way. Now, because the delegates voted general support for the Virginia plan to become the basis of consideration, and because the Virginia plan called for two houses, that became the basis of most discussions. The equal state delegates were also the delegates who had originally wanted a single-body legislature. The New Jersey plan, which had been introduced a few weeks after the Virginia plan, called for a single legislature. Now, this was all, of course, tied up in what we discussed last week about proportional representation versus state representation. The people who wanted states to have equal representation in the legislature were also the same people that wanted a single-body legislature. After the majority of the convention voted for proportional representation in both houses, the equal state folks got behind the idea of two houses in the legislature so that at least one of them would offer equal representation. So by a month or two into the convention, pretty much everyone was on board with a proposal that included two houses. There remained debates about how those two houses would be populated, but the decision to have two houses was pretty much a consensus by that point. Another big issue of debate was how long a term of office should be in the legislature. Many delegates wanted a term of 1 year. In fact, Massachusetts had instructed its delegates to demand a single-year term and also to allow states to recall members during that year if they wanted. For many, these regular elections, which were the norm in most state legislatures at the time, were a way of ensuring that representatives always reflected the will of the people. Too much time between elections meant more time to get swayed by others in Congress rather than listening to their constituents. Under the Articles of Confederation, appointments to the Continental Congress were annual and were subject to recall. Of course, there was no requirement that they be elected, and in most cases the governor or state legislature appointed delegates to the Confederation Congress. The Virginia plan literally left this issue blank. When the plan was first introduced, it read, quote, "The members of the first branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by the people of the several states every blank for a term of blank." Others thought that the one-year terms were a mistake. Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer of Maryland proposed 3-year terms, arguing that annual elections made people indifferent to them, and that made it more difficult to find candidates willing to run with such frequency. In other words, elections were all the time, nobody would even give it a second thought, they just tend to re-elect the same guys over and over again. Madison and Hamilton also supported 3-year terms. They and others argued that congressmen needed time to understand how government worked, and that a constant churn would prevent that. There was also the time that it took to travel to the nation's capital, finding housing there, all that sort of thing. Having to return home all the time for elections would prove difficult. In the end, the convention compromised on 2-year terms for the House. In the Senate, there was a whole range of proposed term lengths. Proposals included 3, 4, 5, 7, 9 years, even lifetime appointments. Senators were envisioned as the wise elder statesmen who were somewhat detached from the people and could serve as a check on the House when that popular branch went too far. Much of the debate compared the Senate terms to those in the British Parliament, which were 7 years. Madison wanted 9-year terms so that they would line up with the 3-year terms that he wanted in the House, so that in every 3 House elections you'd also have a Senate election. Having terms that didn't line up meant that the elections would not be held together in the same year. When the convention decided to reduce the terms in the House from 3 years to 2 years, Madison also accepted the idea that Senate terms should be 6 years, so that there would still be a Senate election in 1 out of every 3 House elections. Senators would be selected by state governments rather than elected directly. The Virginia plan had chosen that senators would be chosen by members of the House. Pretty early on, though, the overwhelming majority of delegates wanted state governments to choose their senators. The Senate was going to be a protection of state sovereignty within the federal government. There really wasn't any support for the direct election of senators at the convention. The convention also debated whether either house should have term limits for its members or whether its members should be subject to recall. As I said, under the Articles of Confederation, appointed delegates could be recalled at any time during their 1-year terms. Further, no one under the Articles of Confederation was allowed to serve more than 3 terms in a row in Congress. Debate over the power to recall members of the House or Senate never got much traction. Although a vocal minority liked the idea, the notion of recalling representatives mid-session and then having to hold new elections to replace them was just considered unworkable. Beyond that, many delegates wanted representatives to have a greater ability to act independent of transitional popular opinion back home. Voters at home were not privy to all the debates and reasons for decisions that representatives would have. As a result, representatives had to be free to use their own best judgment on matters. Now, there was probably a better case for recalling senators. After all, they had 6-year terms if they proved unpopular, and since the state legislature appointed them, it would be easy to get the state legislature to replace them. But the nationalists wanted the Senate to be a body of wise and deliberative men who were aloof from the factional majorities that might form the House. These wiser, independent leaders should not be looking at popular disapproval for their actions. That was why some delegates wanted to give them actually lifetime tenure, so that they would just be there for their entire lives and could only be removed by, some sort of impeachment or something. In the end, they would have to face reappointment every 6 years and could not be recalled any time short of that. Now, for similar reasons, the convention did not allow states to saddle representatives with instructions. Many state governments had gotten used to the idea of instructing their delegates on how to vote on certain issues. Supporters of the new federal system believed that representatives should be allowed to use their own judgment and not be hamstrung by rules imposed by people back home who were not part of the national debates. Now, you have to remember that most of the people attending this convention had served as delegates under the Articles of Confederation. Therefore, they understood these frustrations very well from the perspective of the delegate and, of course, wanted to give representatives more freedom. The delegates also rejected the idea of term limits. The Virginia plan had initially anticipated some term limits on members of Congress. Madison also proposed at one point that members of Congress be ineligible for any other federal office for at least 1 year after leaving their elected office. He saw this as a way to prevent members from creating government jobs for themselves. In the end, though, the delegates rejected all of this. The states voted unanimously against term limits. From their perspective, the term limit rules in the Articles of Confederation had proven to be a disaster. Those limits essentially sidelined some of the best delegates from further service, while putting up a B team to continue to represent their state. So the convention decided that members could continue to run for office as long as the people continued to re-elect them. The convention also debated other restrictions on members of Congress beyond being able to win an election. A big one was whether immigrants could serve in Congress. This raised some debate. Hamilton, in particular, strongly opposed a proposal to restrict members of Congress to native-born Americans. Some have argued that he did this out of self-interest, having been born in the West Indies. Hamilton, however, probably would have been eligible since he was a citizen when the U.S. was created. Hamilton was more concerned that highly qualified people from Europe might immigrate and would be able to add greatly to the nation through government service. They should not be prevented from running. That should be a matter left up to the voters. Supporters of requiring elected officials to be native-born or longtime citizens argued that outsiders could come into the government and change it based on their attachments to their home countries and also with foreign ideas that were incompatible with the American form of government. There were considerable debates on how long to require an immigrant to be a citizen before they could run for office. In the end, the delegates agreed that all members of the House and Senate should be citizens. They initially placed a restriction that members must be a citizen for at least 3 years before holding office. In the final version, they changed this to 7 years, and for the Senate, they settled on 9 years. There was also the question of residency. Could an outsider, say a member of another state or district, move into an area immediately and run for office? Some delegates thought there should be some period of years before someone could run for office in any particular area, so that they could truly represent those who elected them. In the end, the convention required that elected officials to reside in the state that they wanted to represent, but there was no waiting requirement. If the official became an inhabitant of the state just before the election, that was good enough. Delegates also considered age restrictions. There were some, like Wilson, who argued for no restrictions on age. If a candidate gained the confidence of the voters, even at a very young age, youth should not bar him from serving. Initially, the delegates set the age at 21. That was the traditional age of adulthood at the time, when a man could make contracts and do other certain things under the law. George Mason, however, argued that the age limit should be higher. His argument was that a man should not be considered a child one day and able to represent people in government the next. Mason, who was age 62 at the time, also noted that he looked back on the foolish mistakes of his youth in his early 20s, and he believed that everyone would become wiser with age. He moved that the minimum age should be set at 25. In the end, a majority of the states agreed, 7-3, to set the minimum age for the House at 25. Of course, delegates also argued for a higher age for senators. The Senate was to be a place for more mature, stable, and experienced men, despite the fact that several delegates at the convention that was making the rules were still in their 20s. The delegates voted to set a minimum age of 30 for senators. There seems to have been little debate over how each house would choose its own leaders. Neither the Virginia plan nor the New Jersey plan even touched on the issue. There was a general consensus that the House of Representatives would choose its own leader, called a Speaker. This was based on the British Speaker of the House of Commons. The House also received the power to create other officers as it deemed necessary. The details of all that was going to be left up to the House members themselves once they established the House of Representatives. There was not much thought given at all to the leader of the Senate. It was typical that in most state upper houses, or in the House of Lords in Britain, that there was no leader. These bodies were small enough and collegial enough that they generally did not need a leader. It wasn't until near the end of the convention when the committee, called the Committee on Unfinished Parts, proposed that the vice president preside over the Senate. The main reason for doing this was simply to give the vice president something to do. The Constitution envisioned having a vice president, but assigned him no powers at all. Now, there were some objections to putting the vice president in charge of the Senate. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts argued that this would be akin to placing the president in charge of the legislature, and that it would destroy the independence of the legislature. Similarly, George Mason argued that this was mixing legislative and executive branches, which ought to be kept separate. Others, however, pointed out that if the Senate chose one of their own to lead, that one state would be denied one of its 2 votes in the Senate, except in cases of a tie. The convention ended up voting to let the vice president sit as the ex officio president of the Senate, although the final wording would end up saying that he would sit as president of the Senate. The convention also established that each house would have the power to set rules for itself and punish its own members. They very definitely did not want outsiders to be able to intervene in the operations of the House and Senate. Both the House and Senate were given the power to expel their own members, again, without any outside involvement. You couldn't appeal to the courts, you couldn't go to the executive. This was solely an internal matter for Congress. Madison recommended requiring a 2/3 vote for expulsion in order to prevent extremely factionalized majorities from removing minority members just because they didn't like them. The majority agreed with Madison, so it took 2/3 to remove a member of either house. I really want to emphasize, however, that no other branches of government had power to remove members of Congress. Contrast this with the fact that Congress did give itself the power to remove any member of the executive or judicial branches through impeachment. Congress was meant to be the branch with the most control over all three branches of government. While the convention allowed states to set elections, it also gave Congress the power to overrule state election dates and mandate its own date for federal elections. It gave each house the authority to judge the results of the elections of its members, again without any outside interference from other branches or the states. Further, members, with some exceptions, could not be subject to arrest while Congress was in session or while traveling to or from sessions of Congress. Members also could not be questioned anywhere for speech and debate made in Congress. Delegates were well aware that by creating other branches of government, those branches might try to interfere with Congress or attack individual members, and this was an effort by the delegates to prevent that possibility and leave members of Congress free to discuss anything they wanted. Another rule was that all bills for raising revenue had to originate in the House, not the Senate. You may ask, what does it matter? Both houses have to approve it anyway. Part of the argument was that the House was closest to the people and representative of the people, and that whole taxation without representation thing meant that the House that represented the people should control proposals to raise taxes. When the convention was debating the interests of large versus small states, some of the large states argued that it was unfair that smaller states, contributing far less in taxes, should have equal power in originating money bills. In response, this rule about the House originating all bills raising revenue was given to the large state faction to say, all right, look, the House that has proportional representation is going to start all financial issues, so that should make it a big deal. Of course, it was all meaningless, since the Senate could amend any bill that was started in the House, and that amendment could say whatever it wanted, including greatly increasing revenue requests, and then just send it back to the House. Both houses would have to pass all laws, although the power to make treaties and appoint members of other branches was limited to the Senate, and we'll probably get into that a little more next week when we discuss the executive branch. The convention also listed the specific powers which the Congress would have. Number 1 was borrowing money, which was much of the purpose of the Continental Congress. The second thing listed was regulating commerce, both at home and abroad. Recall that this was the primary goal of the Annapolis Convention and played such a large role in creating the demand for this convention in Philadelphia. It also gave Congress the power to establish uniform rules of naturalization so that states could not create their own. There were a great many financial powers for Congress. Establishing bankruptcy rules, coining money, punishment of counterfeiting were all given to Congress, with an eye toward preventing financial abuses like Rhode Island had committed in recent years. It explicitly took away the power of states to create their own money or create their own legal tender. Congress had the power to declare war, raise armies and navies, deal with crimes on the high seas. It shared with states the power to arm and regulate militia. It denied states the power to enter into foreign treaties, grant letters of marque, etc. They could not maintain standing armies or ships of war. The federal government would have exclusive power related to war and foreign policy. Finally, the convention granted Congress exclusive power of a district that would become the seat of government. After their experience in Philadelphia, where local officials had refused to protect Congress from angry Continental soldiers, the delegates wanted to be sure that this new Congress could regulate its own local government. The Constitution did not specify where this district would be, but it did call on states to cede some land to make an independent jurisdiction that could be controlled by Congress. Next week, we're going to turn our attention to what the convention thought an executive branch should look like. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCade, and 10crucialdays.com. I also want to welcome Tom McGarry, who joined on Patreon at the standard bearer level this month. Like everyone who joins at the $10 level or higher, Tom will receive a different flag from the American Revolution each month. And remember that you can also subscribe for as little as $2 a month to receive access to commercial-free episodes. I also want to thank Robert Reynolds and Julie Musick for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. If you don't want to make an ongoing financial commitment to the podcast, then PayPal or Venmo is a great way to make a one-time gift, and it is very much appreciated. Before we get into this week's episode, I want to remind everyone that our next live Zoom event will take place on April 9th, 2025. Joining us will be John Moss, author of From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. You'll have an opportunity to participate in the discussion and ask questions. You can always email me for an invitation, but if you'd like to receive notices of all of our upcoming live events, be sure to get on my mailing list at MailChimp or just sign up on Patreon. Even free members on Patreon will be notified of these live events. Now, this week we covered most of the debates over what the U.S. Congress should look like. Debates over things like one or two houses, how members should be chosen, what terms they would serve. Issues involving Congress probably consumed most of the debate at the convention. I find it more than a little ironic that we often hear people today claim that there are three co-equal branches of government. And they usually make this claim when the president pushes too hard against the powers that belong to Congress or the courts. I don't think that the founders thought of the branches as being co-equal. For them, Congress was the government. The executive branch was a necessary addition to government simply to carry out Congress's legislation. Similarly, the courts were also there to enforce the laws that were passed by Congress. Congress was the only branch that existed under the Articles. In Britain, the king, of course, headed the executive branch, but by this time he was seen largely as a ceremonial figure. In a government of the people, the legislative body that represented the people was the primary force that was the government. Now, this point is reinforced by the fact that Congress gave itself the power to remove the president or judges through impeachment, but members of Congress could only be removed by their fellow members. No other branch has any say in that. Also, only Congress has a say in verifying elections. Neither the president nor the courts have any formal role in that. Now, there is no way in the Constitution to challenge congressional decisions regarding elections or impeachments in the courts. There actually was a case in the 1960s when Congress refused to seat a black congressman who had been involved in a few scandals. Adam Clayton Powell had been a powerful figure in the House for years. When Congress refused to seat him after his 1966 re-election, Powell missed the entire Congress. He was actually re-elected in 1968 and finally got to the Supreme Court in 1969. Even though the court is not supposed to have a say over membership rules, the court gave its rationale for intervening in House affairs because the House had refused to seat Powell in the first place. Because of that, he was not yet a member and could not be subject to the unreviewable decision in the House. And this made a very big difference because although Powell was not seated by a vote of the majority of the House, he would not have had 2/3 calling for his expulsion. We also see courts getting involved in other things. Everybody remembers their involvement in the presidential election of Bush v. Gore. I think there are a lot of constitutional problems with the court even hearing that decision, let alone its ruling. Not going to get into that here, but just to say that there are a lot of challenges to the idea that Congress has exclusive jurisdictions over a great many things in government, but that is the way the framers saw things. Many of the debates that they had at the time were different from how we feel about them today. For example, I talked about how New Englanders fought extremely hard to have annual elections for members of Congress. An elected leader should not go more than a year without having the people affirm that he should stay there. Such regular elections were critical to making sure a representative stayed loyal to the will of the voters. Conceding to the idea of 2-year terms for the House was a big fight for many who thought 1-year terms were an essential cornerstone to representative government. Well, today, of course, many people argue that a 2-year term is too short and that it forces members into a constant election mode. So that's just a very different view of the way of thinking between 1787 and today. I also mentioned at one point that members could not be detained while traveling to or from Congress except for felonies. This was included so that officials might not try to prevent representatives from arriving on time to vote or participating in important debates or otherwise harass disliked officials. There were occasions in British history where the King's men had detained members of Parliament so that they could win a vote in Parliament. I do, however, know that this provision has been used at times by members of Congress to get out of speeding tickets. Despite all the disagreement at the convention, most of the rules seem to have held up pretty well. There have not been any amendments that change the way Congress works. There have been a few that changed who was allowed to vote for Congress, but none involving most of the other details as to how Congress operates. So I think we can say that at least these rules from the convention have stood the test of time. My book recommendation this week is 1787, The Grand Convention, by Clinton Rossiter. This is an older book, first published in 1966. It does a great job of walking the reader through the convention, dividing the convention into several phases. It's only about 300 pages, not counting notes and index and appendices, but the book also really does have a great series of appendices, which include original copies of the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and a copy of what the Constitution looked like in early August, more than a month before the final version was completed. The author, Clinton Rossiter, was a professor at Cornell University and the author of many award-winning books. His book on the convention was one of his final works. There are copies of the book that you can borrow on archive.org if you want to take a look at it before buying. But if you're interested in the convention and how it played out, Clinton Rossiter's 1787, The Grand Convention, is considered a classic. If you want to understand the convention as it unfolded, you may want to take a look at my online recommendation. The National Park Service has a site called the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Within that, it includes several other pages that have day-by-day results from the convention. So you can go to a page that will summarize all of the debates that happened on each day that occurred during the convention. It'll tell you the votes taken, which members came or left Congress, and other things that happened around Philadelphia on that particular day. It's a great way to get an understanding of how the convention unfolded. And of course, as always, I've included links to this site on both my blog and website. My question this week comes from John Salentano, who asks, are there any events going on in the Boston area for the anniversary of Lexington and Concord? Well, John, both Lexington and Concord have been fighting for generations over which gets the credit for the shot heard around the world, and it kind of would have been nice if they had coordinated their celebrations, but they never have, and they didn't this time either. Concord is holding a parade on the anniversary, April 19th, doing an early morning reenactment of Dr. Prescott's arrival with the warning about the British regulars. There's also going to be a living history event at Minuteman National Historical Park, and a light and drone show that evening. Lexington is celebrating with a multi-day event that begins on Thursday, April 17th, with an award ceremony and a special event by Ken Burns. For those of you who aren't aware, Burns is coming out with a documentary on the American Revolution this fall. Very much looking forward to that. On Friday evening, there will be a reenactment of Paul Revere's Ride. There will also be a very early reenactment on Lexington Green that begins at 5 a.m. on Saturday. This is around the same time as the original battle, so you got to be pretty hardcore to get out there and see that. Over the course of the day, there's a number of different ceremonies scheduled, as well as a parade. There's also a concert in the evening. Lexington doesn't have anything scheduled for Sunday, but there are a few more living history events and ceremonies scheduled for Monday the 21st. So if you're going to be up there for any of those days, it might be worth checking out. You can get more details on both events Go to visitconcord.org for the Concord events and lex250.org for the Lexington events. Now, surprisingly, Boston itself is doing almost nothing. I spoke with a few of my history friends in Boston who told me that the city seemed like it had completely ignored events until a few weeks ago. Thankfully, some folks who run the Paul Revere House and a few other key historic sites in the city have been working on a few things. There will be an event on Paul Revere Mall on Friday evening. There will be some live music and a reading of the play Revolution's Edge. Reenactors will then row Paul Revere across to Charleston, where he will begin his ride to Lexington. There's also going to be a ceremony in Old North Church. So if you're in the area, some of these events sound like they could be fun. I am hopeful, though, that we will see some better 250 events as things ramp up next year. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.